discuss the Constitutional Court judgment expected to be handed down at 10 in that case of contempt of court against the former President Jacob Zuma that was brought by the Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture. Karyn, we were still talking about, and maybe we can just speed it up in terms of just quickly sketching the background as to how we got to this point.
Well, there was a long-running interplay between the Commission and the former president, which ultimately resulted in the inquiry bringing an application for a subpoena to compel him to appear. He then, after that subpoena was granted, sought the recusal of the deputy, in that timeline, sought the recusal of the Deputy Chief Justice as the presiding officer, saying that he perceived him to be biased against him because of an interpersonal relationship they had, but also because of his suspicions about the impartiality of the inquiry. Ultimately, of course, walking out of the commission, which is at the point at which the Deputy Chief Justice, with the Secretary of the inquiry, going to the Constitutional Court last year in an urgent hearing that was heard by the court on, I think, the 29th of December, to compel Jacob Zuma to not only appear before the inquiry, but to answer non-incriminating questions. They insisted that he did not have a blanket right to silence, which his counsel had previously suggested he may enjoy. Of course, once that the court ruling in the inquiry's favor, but Jacob Zuma then defying the orders and the judgment given by the highest court in the country by refusing to go before the inquiry. He's made it clear in statements that he did so because of this recusal application, amongst other reasons, but also launching very angry and vociferous attacks, not only against the Constitutional Court, who he has compared to the apartheid government, but also against the judiciary in general, suggesting that certain judges were being paid by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and claiming that he was effectively defying the Constitutional Court because just as he had defied the apartheid authorities because he believed they were acting in violation of his rights.
Well, another issue of contention is something that was raised by the former president and again through the J.G. Zuma Foundation in a statement that they released, Karyn, where they question the commission approaching the Constitutional Court as the apex court in the land, as a court of first instance. Let's just talk about that, what the play is around that particular move and whether they have a point here in terms of whether a lower court should have been approached in the first instance.
I think that's that is a salient point. Ultimately, the Constitutional Court needs to be the one to decide whether Jacob Zuma is guilty of contempt or defiance of his orders, because they were the court that granted those orders in the first place. But in terms of going directly to the Constitutional Court, one of the arguments the inquiry made was, look, we just don't have time. We're running out of time. We don't have a large span of time in which to engage in a court process, possible appeals. We are ultimately embarking on a principle that, everyone is equal before the law, and we want constitutional certainty on this, but we're going to our highest court in the land. The court itself was very critical of the inquiry for taking as long as it did to even subpoena Jacob Zuma, and having a lot of strong words about its delay and its so-called special treatment of him, because they said it was extraordinary that the subpoena application happened in the first place. But this issue of a court, Jacob Zuma, at this point having no ability to appeal, no room to maneuver, if this court decides that he is going to go to jail for contempt, there is literally nothing he can do. And I think that informs a lot of, the disquiet and very vocalized animosity of the J.G. Zuma Foundation. However, the inquiry's counter to that is, we gave you multiple opportunities, to come to the court to vocalize your side of things in the initial application. You didn't do so. You didn't even file a notice to abide. In terms of the contempt, we asked you what about your sanction. We asked you for the court, the highest court in the country, sought your input on the sanction. You did not provide it. And therefore, you've had these opportunities within this process to vocalize where you're coming from, and you have chosen not to do so. That being said, however, it is going to be one of the massive contentious points here, because even the most vociferous critic of Jacob Zuma will feel some level of disquiet as to the fact that if the court finds against him, finds that he should go to prison, there is literally nothing he can do.
And speaking of, there was, of course, also a lot of interest, Karyn, in the Constitutional Court's approach when Chief Justice Mogoeng directed former President Zuma to file an affidavit that will advise what penalty the court should actually impose if it were to find him in contempt of court.
And that very much indicates, I mean, that happened 2 weeks after the hearing. That very much indicates that the Constitutional Court is going to find that he is in contempt of court. The fact that it has taken 3 months for it to deliver a ruling on an urgent case, which is far longer than it took in the original judgment, indicates very strongly that this court, has had trouble coming to some form of agreement or, even split decision with regard to what the punishment for that non-compliance, for that defiance must be. The fact that they reached out to the former president, a lot of legal analysts saying, well, that is very normal within the process of a criminal trial when someone has been found guilty of something, to give them an opportunity to provide evidence in aggravation and mitigation of sentence. But this is kind of a weird hybrid, really, because it is coming out of a civil process, but it is ultimately a criminal sanction. Contempt of court is a criminal sanction for criminal defiance of rule of law. So, we are sitting with this extraordinary situation where the court is doing these things, I think, trying to be as fair as possible, but in a situation where there is no playbook for this. It hasn't happened before. We know P.W. Botha was found guilty of contempt of the TRC, but ultimately successfully challenging that in a kind of civil, legal, technical way in the Western Cape High Court, so not facing the final punishment that had been imposed on him. Jacob Zuma's situation is absolutely extraordinary. And we can't necessarily predict what's going to happen here.
And the public, of course, very interested on the point that you've just made, the public wanting to know whether the processes that have unfolded are actually normal. Would a normal South African who is not a former president or someone of a high stature in society, would they be afforded the same sort of right? Give us an affidavit telling us why you think or what you think the punishment should be. People are asking that. Also, Zuma filing an affidavit to contest the application, that was asked, did not happen. What do you think his reason was not to contest the application, if you were to speculate, Karyn?
Well, I mean, I think, this is an extraordinary thing, because with the original judgment that the Constitutional Court gave, Justice Chris Jafta saying, at pains to say on behalf of the court, look, this is an issue of rule of law. And everyone is equal before the law, whether, I am summoned, you're summoned, anyone's summoned, we have to go before the commission. Just as if we're summoned to appear in court, we need to go before the court in a criminal or civil context. If I'm having a maintenance dispute and I'm summoned to court, I need to go. That is at the heart of rule of law. We all understand and respect that the courts have these abilities to compel us to appear. So the court ultimately saying that, everyone is fundamentally equal before the law, and Jacob Zuma, just like everyone else, should be expected to appear. The important thing to remember with contempt is it's pretty much, it's never really used. It's used as this kind of threat. If I don't appear in court or someone can issue an arrest warrant for me and I can be held in contempt. And so I go, because there's always this thing hanging over my head that there can be this potential sanction. Well, Jacob Zuma is essentially playing a giant game of legal chicken with the Constitutional Court, because he's saying, well, I'm not going. What are you going to do about it? And the rest of South Africa is going, well, if he doesn't go, why should I? Why should the former president get special treatment? And that's why this case is so important. Beyond who the people are, what the court does here is ultimately about rule of law. It's about the equal application of rule of law to everyone. And there may be a fundamental sort of are they going to actually send Jacob Zuma to prison over this? But fundamentally, if they don't take a hard line, if there isn't a form of palpable sanction here, if there isn't a consequence, the message to ordinary people who are already sick and tired, of feeling like their government doesn't necessarily hold itself to the same standards as it expects of them, I think is going to be pretty devastating.
So, looking back at the former president's reason for not testifying before the commission and why the summons had to be issued, he wanted the commission's chairperson, the Deputy Chief Justice, to recuse himself. And some people dismissed that, offhand, saying, he should just appear, while others were of the view that Zondo should just recuse himself, let the commission continue to hear Zuma, and then he could return. What do you make of all of that and how it's been handled?
Well, interestingly enough, Jacob Zuma did file that application before the Pretoria High Court where he sought the DCJ Raymond Zondo's recusal. That case has not progressed past the initial application. Zondo has provided the record of his decision in regards to not recusing himself. And now the onus is on the former president to go to file further papers to take the case forward. He hasn't done so. And so we're really at a stalemate. So, if he is serious about this aspect of the non-recusal, he has the ability to pursue that in the courts, and he has not done so. That being said, that was a key issue that came up in the initial case, and the inquiry's position was unless you get an interdict, against the DCJ or preventing the summons from being implemented, or you seek a sort of urgent form of relief to say, well, I'll come, but I don't want it to be before him, et cetera, that case really has no standing to prevent the summons from being implemented. So, they're saying it has no legal force and effect. And essentially, Jacob Zuma has given a lot of, arguments about impartiality, his feelings that the DCJ is somehow biased against him, that this is a project aimed specifically at him. Which, he did not vocalize in the Constitutional Court, and he didn't put before the Constitutional Court. So while that process is going on at the Pretoria High Court, it's stalled. It wasn't one of the issues that, that he substantively allowed the court to address or to grapple with. It was brought forward, and the inquiry was questioned about it. But, he had that opportunity then to say, look, fundamentally, I think this man is biased against me. I want these other remedies. What is possible? He didn't take that opportunity. He just opted completely out of the process. And what's also interesting is that we see within the context of his criminal case that he's adopted a lot of the same language. He's suggesting that if the court in that instance, which is meant to sit on the 19th of July to determine his special plea in which he's seeking an acquittal before trial of all the charges against him, he's saying that if the court doesn't do the right thing, he will simply not cooperate with that process. And that is actually not an option that is available to him there. But it seems to be that this situation here, in terms of the paralysis of the Constitutional Court up until this point, has given this sense of empowerment to say, well, if I'm not happy with the court process, I'm not happy with the legal process, I don't have to get involved in it. And I don't think that is a constitutionally sustainable argument.
Well, so much to talk about. But just finally, Karyn, if an imprisonment judgment is handed down today, how is this likely, to impact? You mentioned the other case in the arms deal case where former president is also wanting prosecutor Billy Downer to recuse himself or to be removed because of partiality, as the former president claims. How does this then impact other cases such as that one? And also, as you said, this is huge. This is precedent setting. How is this likely to play out if, and I say if, the former president is handed an imprisonment judgment?
Well, there's a few options. The Constitutional Court could turn around and, because the inquiry has been extended, give him a suspended sentence, say, well, if you go before the inquiry and give evidence, the sentence could be suspended. Given his language of defiance, I'm not sure that he would comply with that. However, part of the judgment also, what the inquiry sought was an order directing the National Commissioner of Police and the Police Minister to make good on the arrest and the arrest aspect, and then the subsequent imprisonment of the former president, if indeed that is what it comes to. And then we have, the extraordinary situation of Jacob Zuma as someone who is in prison, potentially coming to his trial, in orange overalls, which, as a sentenced prisoner, which is an extraordinary thought. I mean, the one thing about South Africa is you really can't make this stuff up, and this is where we are today. But, there is an option that if indeed he is imprisoned today, he will arrive at his trial as an inmate.
Well, Karyn Maughan, let's leave it there for now. But of course, 10 a.m. is when that judgment will be handed down. Legal journalist Karyn Maughan discussing the developments around this case ahead of the expected Constitutional Court judgment on whether former President Jacob Zuma is in fact guilty of contempt of court for refusing to testify before the Judicial Commission, and whether the court will actually grant what the commission asked for in terms of a 2-year jail sentence. All of that will play out here on SABC. We'll keep you informed as and when it happens.